Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The figure in the fog knows my name. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The Arrival. Megan Carter tightened her grip on the steering wheel as her car crept along the winding road, the dense fog swallowing everything in its path. The headlights barely pierced the thick gray shroud, revealing only fleeting glimpses of towering pine trees and the occasional signpost. It felt as though the world was dissolving into a formless void, and for a brief moment, Megan wondered if she'd made a mistake coming here. Town of Ravenswood appeared out of nowhere, like a shadowy mirage. Megan's breath caught in her throat as she drove down its narrow main street, the fog pressing against the windows as if it had a mind of its own. The town was small, with old, weathered buildings lining the street, their wooden facades bleached by time and the relentless fog. She passed a diner, its neon sign flickering weakly, and a general store that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. It was eerily quiet, save for the low hum of her car's engine. Megan pulled up to her new home, an old Victorian house at the edge of town. It stood tall and imposing, its dark silhouette barely visible through the fog. The air was damp and cold as she stepped out of the car, her footsteps muffled by the mist that clung to the ground. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in her chest. Inside, the house was dimly lit, the weak evening light filtering through the dusty windows. Megan set her bags down in the foyer, the wooden floor creaking underfoot. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This was her chance to start over, to leave behind the pain of her past. The fog was just that fog, nothing more. That night, as Megan lay in bed, the silence of the town became suffocating. She tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. It was just exhaustion, she told herself. But then she heard it, a whisper, faint and distant, calling her name. Megan shot up, her heart pounding in her chest. She strained to listen, but all she could hear was the blood rushing in her ears. She walked to the window, pulling back the curtain. The fog was thicker than ever, swirling like a living entity. And there, at the edge of her yard, stood a figure, barely more than a shadow against the gray. Megan blinked, and it was gone, swallowed by the mist. She backed away from the window, her pulse racing. It was just the fog playing tricks on her, she thought. But the sense of dread lingered long after she returned to bed, unable to shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. The next morning, she met Sheriff Tom Harris, a grizzled man with a wary look in his eyes. He greeted her with a nod, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Later, her neighbor Emily Grant, a middle-aged woman with a nervous smile, stopped by with a basket of muffins. "The fog here, it has a way of getting to you," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. Megan tried to press her for more, but Emily quickly changed the subject, her gaze flitting nervously to the fog outside. As the day wore on, Megan couldn't shake the feeling that the figure in the fog was more than just her imagination. The town was hiding something, and she had a sinking feeling that she was about to be caught in the middle of it. Chapter 2. The Town's Secrets. Megan's sleep was restless, haunted by images of the shadowy figure in the fog. When she finally woke, the morning light did little to ease her unease. The fog was still there, thick and impenetrable, as if it had decided to make the town its permanent home. She got dressed, trying to shake off the lingering dread from the night before, and decided to explore Ravenswood, hoping that getting to know the town would help her feel more settled. The main street was eerily quiet as Megan walked along the cracked sidewalks. She passed the same diner from the night before, now with a few weary patrons inside, sipping coffee and staring blankly out the window. The general store had a lone customer, an older man who nodded curtly at her before returning to his business. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional creak of a weathered sign or the distant caw of a crow. Megan tried to engage a few townsfolk in conversation, but they were polite to the point of being curt, their eyes sliding away from hers, as if they knew something she didn't. Whenever she mentioned her new home or asked about the fog, the atmosphere would shift, and the already brief exchanges would end abruptly. It was as if the entire town was keeping a secret, one that they had no intention of sharing with an outsider like her. As she wandered back home, the fog clinging to her clothes like a damp shroud, Megan decided to explore her house more thoroughly. The Victorian was old, its walls steeped in the kind of history that seemed to whisper from the floorboards. In the attic, she found boxes filled with remnants of the past, faded letters, old trinkets, and dusty photo albums. It was in one of these albums that Megan made a chilling discovery. As she flipped through the pages, her eyes landed on a photograph that sent a shiver down her spine. It was an old black and white image of a woman standing in front of the house. The woman looked almost exactly like Megan, same dark hair, same piercing eyes. But it wasn't just the uncanny resemblance that unnerved her. In the background of the photograph, barely visible through the grainy texture, was the same thick fog that now blanketed the town. And within that fog was a shadowy figure, standing just at the edge, almost as if it had been watching the woman, just as it had watched Megan. Her heart raced as she stared at the photograph, the edges of her vision blurring with the intensity of her fear. Who was this woman? And why did she look so much like Megan? She hurried downstairs, the old wooden stairs groaning under her weight, and tried to shake off the creeping dread that was beginning to take root deep within her. Over the next few days, Megan's attempts to ask the townspeople about the photograph and the figure in the fog were met with resistance. Some grew pale at the mention of it, their eyes widening in fear, while others snapped at her, warning her to leave well enough alone. The friendly small-town facade was cracking, revealing an undercurrent of fear and anger that made Megan feel more isolated than ever. The nights were the worst. Megan started having vivid nightmares where the figure in the fog came closer each time, its form becoming clearer, its whispers louder. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her room filled with an unnatural chill, as if the fog had seeped inside, wrapping around her like icy tendrils. The boundary between dream and reality blurred, and Megan found herself questioning her sanity. As the fog outside grew thicker, Megan felt the weight of the town's secrets pressing down on her. Whatever haunted Ravenswood wasn't just a relic of the past, it was alive, and it had its sights set on her. Chapter 3: The First Attack. Megan's anxiety over the fog grew palpable, gnawing at her nerves day and night. The constant unease had her on edge, her mind racing with unanswered questions about the photograph and the figure she'd seen in it. She spent her days scouring old newspapers and town records, trying to piece together the puzzle. But the answers remained elusive, buried under layers of secrecy and fear. That night, the fog pressed against her windows like a living thing, its cold breath seeping through the thin gaps in the old wooden frames. Megan was jolted awake by a whispering voice, now unmistakably clear, calling her name with a chilling urgency. Her heart pounded as she scanned the darkened room, the voice reverberating through her bones. She hurriedly threw on a robe and checked the windows, but the fog was already seeping inside, swirling around the room in ghostly tendrils. The temperature dropped sharply, and her breath came out in visible puffs of frost. Megan frantically locked every window and door, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the latches. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination running wild, but the oppressive cold and the whispering voice told a different story. The fog seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Objects in the room began to shift on their own books, tumbled off shelves. A picture frame crashed to the floor, and her old rocking chair creaked and swayed as if guided by unseen hands. Megan's pulse raced as a bone-deep chill enveloped her, making it difficult to breathe. Desperation drove her to seek answers. The next day, she visited Mrs. Langley, the town historian, hoping the elderly woman might shed some light on the terror that gripped her. Mrs. Langley's cottage was cluttered with dusty tomes and old maps, the air thick with the scent of mothballs and must. The historian's face paled when Megan mentioned the figure in the fog in the photograph. "There's a story," Mrs. Langley began cautiously, her voice trembling. "A curse tied to the fog. Long ago, a man named Elias Thatcher was wronged by the town's founders. In his dying breath, he cursed this land. Since then, those who've lived in your house have met untimely ends claimed by the fog." Megan's heart sank as she listened. The story was horrifying, but it matched the dread she felt creeping into her bones. Mrs. Langley's eyes were filled with pity and fear. "The curse binds the fog to the house. It knows those who are connected to the past." As Megan returned home, the fog seemed to writhe and coil around the house. An uneasy feeling settled over her as she unlocked the door. But before she could react, the figure appeared, more distinct and menacing than ever. It moved closer, its form coalescing into a dark, formless mass. The room grew icy, and Megan's breath came in ragged gasps. The figure's whisper turned into a guttural growl as it reached for her, its hands cold and ethereal, wrapping around her neck with a vice-like grip. Megan gasped for breath, her vision darkening as the figure's icy touch squeezed tighter. Just when she thought she'd succumb to the darkness, she managed to wrench herself free, stumbling back as the figure dissipated into the fog. She fell to the floor, her neck burning where the figure had touched her. A dark, intricate symbol was imprinted on her skin, glowing faintly in the dim light. As she looked at it in horror, she realized the figure's attack had left a mark one that tied her irrevocably to the curse. Her breath came in panicked sobs as the reality of her situation settled in. She was no longer just a spectator. She was a part of this dark legacy, and the figure would not be deterred easily. Chapter 4. The Past Unveiled. Megan's throat burned where the figure had touched her, and the mark on her neck felt like a branding, a permanent reminder of the curse that seemed to be tightening around her. She stared at it in the mirror, the dark symbol glowing faintly in the dim light of her room. Her mind raced with the implications. She had to find out more about the curse, about Elias Thatcher, and why she was now ensnared in this web of darkness. The next day, Megan plunged into research with renewed determination. She visited the local library, a dusty old building that smelled of old paper and forgotten memories. The librarian, a stooped woman named Mrs. Caldwell, eyed Megan warily as she searched through the archives. Megan ignored her stares and focused on the old records and newspapers. Hours of sifting through brittle pages revealed a disturbing history. The town of Ravenswood had been founded on land steeped in rituals and sacrifices. Local legends spoke of a tragic love story involving Elias Thatcher, a man who was wronged by the town's founders. His beloved had been taken from him, and in his dying moments, he cursed the land, vowing that his spirit would return to seek vengeance. The fog, it seemed, was a manifestation of his anger and sorrow. Megan's research took a personal turn when she discovered a family connection to the curse. The name Thatcher appeared in old family records. Her great-great-grandmother had been married to a man named Jonathan Thatcher, Elias's brother. Megan's heart pounded as she realized her family was entwined in the very history she was trying to escape. The figure in the fog wasn't just a random entity. It was targeting her specifically because of this connection. The more Megan learned, the more isolated she felt. Townspeople, who had once been distant, now avoided her altogether. Conversations ended abruptly when she entered the room, and people who had previously offered polite smiles now turned their backs on her. The fog outside grew denser, wrapping around the town like a living, breathing entity, making the air feel heavier with each passing day. At night, the nightmares grew more intense. Megan would lie in bed, shivering despite the layers of blankets as the figure loomed closer in her dreams. The fog enveloped her, and the dark form of Elias Thatcher grew clearer. His face, a twisted mask of rage and sorrow, appeared more often. His eyes locked on her with an intensity that made her heart race. Each night, she saw more of his past, the betrayal, the loss, and the curse that bound him to this land. The figure's whispers grew louder, filling her mind with demands for retribution and filling her with an overwhelming sense of impending doom. Megan woke up gasping for breath, the cold sweat of terror clinging to her skin. The connection to the curse seemed inescapable, and the more she uncovered, the more the figure's grip tightened around her. Ravenswood wasn't just a new chapter in her life. It was a dark, twisted story she was trapped in. The fog continued to thicken, and the weight of the past pressed down on her, leaving her with only one certainty. The figure was getting closer, and the curse was far from over. Chapter 5. The Descent. The fog had seeped into every crevice of Megan's life. Even during the day, when the sun should have banished the gray shroud, the mist seemed to follow her, curling around corners and drifting through the house like a persistent ghost. Her mind was unraveling. The once familiar rooms of her home felt alien, distorted by shadows and whispers that grew louder and more insistent with each passing day. Megan's grip on reality grew tenuous. The whispers she had heard in the night began to intrude on her waking hours, murmuring her name in an incessant chant that left her on edge. The fog inside her house swirled like a living entity, forming eerie shapes and figures that seemed to mock her. She caught glimpses of the figure, its dark outline shifting in the periphery of her vision, always just out of reach. It felt as though the boundary between her nightmares and reality had blurred beyond recognition. The visions of her own death haunted her thoughts. She saw herself lying in a grave, her face pale and lifeless, the figure looming over her with a look of grim satisfaction. These disturbing images were so vivid that Megan began to question her sanity. She would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, her heart racing with a terror that left her breathless. The fear was all-consuming, feeding off her every thought, twisting reality until she could no longer discern what was real. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, Megan packed her belongings, her hands shaking as she stuffed her clothes into a suitcase. The thought of fleeing Ravenswood was the only thing that offered a glimmer of hope. She drove down the road, the fog thickening around her with every mile. Her car headlights barely cut through the dense gray mist, and she could feel the weight of the fog pressing down on her, suffocating her with its cold grip. Panic set in as the fog seemed to follow her, its oppressive presence growing stronger the farther she drove. No matter how fast she drove, the mist seemed to close in, swallowing the road and making her feel trapped in an endless loop. Realizing she couldn't escape, Megan made a U-turn and headed back to Ravenswood, her fear escalating with every passing second. Returning to the town felt like stepping into a trap. Megan's hope of finding solace turned to dread as she sought out Sheriff Tom Harris. She confronted him in his dimly lit office, her voice trembling with anger and desperation. "Why didn't you warn me? Why didn't anyone tell me what was happening?" Sheriff Harris's face was grim as he met her gaze. "Everyone who has ever lived in that house has met a tragic end," he admitted, his voice low and heavy. "We knew you were in danger, but there's not much we can do. The curse is relentless. We hoped you'd be different, but..." Megan's heart sank. The reality of her situation hit her like a sledgehammer. The figure, the fog, the visions, they were all part of a cruel fate she couldn't escape. The town had been watching her, waiting for the inevitable. As the sheriff's words echoed in her mind, she understood that the curse was not just a legend. It was a living, breathing entity that had claimed her as its next victim. The fog outside seemed to press closer, wrapping around her like a vice. Megan felt the weight of the curse closing in on her, her last shred of hope evaporating into the cold, gray mist. She was trapped in a nightmare with no escape, and the figure's whispered promises of death grew louder in her ears. Chapter 6. The Revelation. Megan returned to her house, a sense of despair hanging over her. The fog had thickened to a nearly impenetrable wall, and the oppressive mist seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Her footsteps echoed eerily as she walked through the darkened rooms, each shadow and creak amplifying her growing sense of dread. The knowledge that the townspeople had known about the curse all along and had watched her struggle left a bitter taste in her mouth. But the truth she sought was still out of reach. Determined to uncover the full story behind the curse, Megan combed through the documents she had gathered. The more she read, the clearer the horrifying truth became. Elias Thatcher had been a wronged man, betrayed by the very people who had founded Ravenswood. The town's founders had promised him justice and love, only to turn their backs on him. In his final moments, Elias had cursed the land, and a failed ritual had bound his spirit to the fog. As Megan pieced together the story, she discovered the connection that made her a prime target. Her great-great-grandmother was one of the town's founders, a key figure in the betrayal of Elias Thatcher. This revelation hit Megan like a ton of bricks. Her family, in their quest to establish the town, had inadvertently doomed generations to suffer under Elias's vengeful spirit. Megan was not just a random victim of the curse. She was its intended target, linked directly to the betrayal that had caused it. The fog seemed to close in on her, its cold fingers creeping through the cracks in the house. The figure's presence had become almost constant, its whispers a constant, gnawing presence in her mind. The oppressive atmosphere left her feeling trapped, every corner of her home now a prison of fog and fear. Megan knew that her only chance at breaking the curse lay in confronting Elias directly. With resolve hardening her features, Megan prepared for the final confrontation. She gathered everything she had learned and ventured into the thickening fog that enveloped the house. The fog was so dense that she could barely see her own hand in front of her face. Every step felt like a battle, as if the mist itself was trying to hold her back, to pull her into its cold embrace. As she ventured further into the fog, the figure's form emerged from the murk, more defined than ever. Elias Thatcher's face, twisted with rage and sorrow, loomed large in her vision. His eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to pierce through the fog and straight into her soul. Megan knew she had to confront him, to face the anger and pain that had bound his spirit to this cursed land. She took a deep breath, steeling herself against the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. The final battle against Elias Thatcher was imminent, and with it, the chance to break the curse that had claimed so many lives, including, potentially, her own. As she stood in the heart of the fog, the chilling presence of Elias seemed to engulf her, but Megan felt a flicker of hope. She was ready to face the dark legacy of her family and reclaim her life from the grip of the vengeful spirit. Chapter 7. The Final Confrontation. Megan pushed forward into the fog's oppressive embrace, her breath visible in the freezing air. The mist coiled around her like a living entity, thickening with every step she took toward the heart of the fog, the very spot where the town's founders had performed their ill-fated ritual. Shadows danced in the corners of her vision, and every sound seemed amplified, from the distant howling of the wind to the rustling of the fog. She reached a small clearing, a grim monument to the past. The ground was uneven and scarred, as if something ancient and powerful had left its mark. At the center stood a stone altar, weathered and cracked, a relic from the ritual that had cursed Elias Thatcher's spirit to the fog. The air crackled with dark energy, and Megan felt a shiver of anticipation and fear. Elias Thatcher's figure materialized from the swirling mist, his presence now fully formed and imposing. His face was a mask of anguish and rage, eyes glowing with a supernatural light. The fog seemed to pulse with his anger, growing denser and more suffocating around her. Megan stood her ground, her heart pounding as she faced the spirit that had tormented her. "You can't escape me," Elias's voice echoed through the fog, a guttural growl filled with centuries of pain. "This land is mine, and your family's betrayal binds you to my curse." Megan swallowed hard, steeling herself. "I know about the betrayal, Elias. I know what they did to you. I'm not here to dishonor your memory. I want to end suffering for both you and for myself." She used everything she had learned about Elias's past, the love he had lost, the promises broken, the betrayal that had driven him to curse the land. She spoke with conviction, trying to reach the man behind the vengeful spirit, to appeal to the remnants of humanity left in him. For a moment, Elias seemed to waver, his form flickering in and out of solidity. The fog around them swirled violently, as if struggling against the truth Megan presented. But then, the spirit's face hardened again, and a cruel smile twisted his lips. "There's only one way to break the curse," Elias revealed, his voice cold and final. "A life must be sacrificed, yours, for the salvation of this town. You will be the price for their redemption." Megan's heart sank. The fog thickened, becoming almost impenetrable. The temperature dropped further, turning the air into a biting chill. Her thoughts raced as she realized the gravity of the choice before her. The fog surged around her, the cold intensifying as Elias's figure became more defined and menacing. A struggle erupted, a harrowing blend of physical and psychological horror. Megan fought against the fog as it coiled around her like serpentine tendrils, trying to drag her down. Elias's form advanced, a looming shadow of terror. Each step she took felt like wading through the darkest depths of her own fears. In the heart of the fog, Megan's resolve hardened. She fought back with everything she had, confronting not just Elias, but the deepest parts of her own terror. The fog roared in response, a living entity bent on consuming her. The final confrontation was a desperate battle of wills and survival, a climactic clash between Megan's determination to end the curse and Elias's relentless desire for revenge. As the struggle reached its zenith, the fog seemed to roar in rage and defiance, the outcome hanging in a tenuous balance. Megan's fate and the town's hung by a thread as she faced the ultimate choice that would determine the course of her life and the dark legacy of Ravenswood. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. The fog swirled around Megan, a dense, suffocating shroud that seemed to pulse with Elias Thatcher's frustration. As the struggle continued, she could feel the cold biting through her clothing, the weight of Elias's anger pressing down on her. Her resolve was her only shield against the dark force that sought to drag her into oblivion. With every ounce of strength, Megan fought through the oppressive mist, her thoughts racing as she considered her options. Desperation fueled her actions. Then, an idea struck her, one last, risky gamble. She knew Elias's need for vengeance was rooted in his betrayal and his unfulfilled desires. If she could acknowledge his pain and her connection to it, she might be able to outsmart him. Megan gathered her courage, her voice cutting through the fog with a fierce determination. "Elias," she shouted, "I understand now. Your pain, your betrayal, it's all connected to me. I am part of this legacy. I am not here to defy you, but to end your suffering and set you free. The fog seemed to waver, its cold grip loosening ever so slightly. Elias's form flickered, his rage momentarily overshadowed by confusion. Megan pressed on, her voice steady. Your revenge has only bound you to this land longer. Let me help you break free from this curse. You've been wronged, and I acknowledge that. But continuing this cycle of pain won't bring you peace. The spirit's eyes, glowing with an otherworldly light, met Megan's with a mix of anguish and disbelief. The fog swirled violently, as if wrestling with the truth she presented. Then, as if in response to her plea, the mist began to thin, the oppressive weight lifting ever so slightly. In a final, desperate act of defiance, Megan reached out to Elias. She embraced the truth of their connection, acknowledging both her family's part in his betrayal and the shared suffering that had bound them together. Her sacrifice was not in the form of her life, but in her willingness to confront the darkness and acknowledge the past. The fog began to dissipate, its grip on the town loosening as the sun struggled to break through the gray veil. For the first time in decades, light began to touch the town's streets. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, revealing a town freed from its long-standing curse. Megan stood in the clearing, exhausted and emotionally spent, but alive. The town's residents emerged from their homes, their faces a mix of awe and relief. The curse had been lifted, but the cost was evident in the shadows that lingered in Megan's eyes. In the epilogue of her journey, Megan prepared to leave Ravenswood. She knew that while the town could rebuild and heal, she could never truly escape the memories of her ordeal. The darkness had touched her deeply, and though Elias was gone, a part of the curse lingered in the corners of her mind. As Megan drove away, the fog receded behind her, but the landscape felt forever changed. The town was free, but the darkness that had once enveloped it had left a mark on her soul. The final scene hinted at a subtle, lingering unease, suggesting that while Elias's spirit was at rest, the shadows of the past might not be entirely vanquished.